Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Conspiracy Vault. Going forward, there isn't going to be a strict schedule for the conspiracy episodes, but I will simply aim to release them as and when I have time. And to celebrate the first episode back since my maternity leave, I wanted to start with a topic that has held my interest since the initial event happened, and that is the mysterious disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 departs Amsterdam Schiphol Airport and heads to Kuala Lumpur with 298 souls on board. This included 80 children and 15 crew. 2/3 of the passengers were of Dutch nationality. During this time, there was an ongoing conflict between the Ukrainian military government and Moscow-backed separatist Russian rebels. Because of this, when the commercial Boeing 777 crossed over Ukrainian airspace at 33,000 feet, it was shot down by a Buk surface-to-air missile system developed by the Soviet Union. Because of the amount of Dutch passengers on board who had tragically lost their lives on this fateful day, the Dutch Safety Board, led by Chairman Geber Joustra, led a 15-month, 7-nation investigation. At the final conference, Joustra spoke through the investigation's conclusions surrounding the events that led to the crash of flight MH17. It was concluded that a 9M314M warhead was detonated outside the aircraft on the left side of the cockpit. Upon detonation, thousands of tiny preformed metal objects were ejected with tremendous force. Several hundred of these particles hit the plane, and the 3 crew members in the cockpit would have been killed instantly on impact. The detonation would have caused the front of the plane to break off, and the rest of the plane to break up in the air. The tail section would have landed before the midsection, and the midsection containing the engines landed upside down and on fire in a field in eastern Ukraine, close to the Russian border near Donetsk. The plane covered a wreckage area of 1,550 square kilometres. This narrative was put together through experts who spent 3 months piecing the plane together on a specially made frame in an airbase in the Netherlands. So why was this airliner flying over known hostile territory? Why was it concluded that the aircraft was shot down by a Russian-developed missile? 71 operators from 32 countries flew above the area on the day of the crash. 160 flights had operated above the same airspace on that same day until the airspace was closed after the crash. Perhaps the commercial Boeing 777 was mistaken for a Ukrainian fighter jet. Russia disputed the results of the Dutch investigation, claiming that it was biased. They ran their own investigation, which concluded that the Dutch results were not possible. However, months leading up to that event, at least 16 military aircraft had been shot down over the same airspace, and amateur footage was leaked showing militia members rifling through passengers' cargo, potentially panicking, realising that this was a commercial flight. One person can be heard speaking in Russian, saying something along the lines of what gives them the right to fly through this airspace. Perhaps the most mysterious part of this entire event is actually that, only 4 months before, the very same airline had an entire aircraft with 239 souls on board vanish into thin air. To this day, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 has never been found. On March the 8th, 2014, at 42 minutes past midnight, local time, a daily passenger flight, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370, was leaving Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Its destination, Beijing, China. On board, there were 227 passengers and 10 cabin crew. The aircraft was being piloted by experienced captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and first-time first officer Farik Abdul Hamid. Around an hour into the flight, soaring at 35,000 feet with clear skies, the aircraft was flying over the South China Sea. Malaysian Air Traffic Control instructed the aircraft to signal Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam when they arrived in their airspace. The captain can be heard saying goodbye to Malaysian Air Traffic Control as they head towards new airspace. This was the last contact that anybody had with the captain of MH370. Only 1 minute and 43 seconds later, the aircraft seemingly vanishes into thin air, no longer appearing on radar on either Malaysian or Vietnamese airspace technology. This was such a sudden disappearance that it took Malaysian air traffic control around 18 minutes to even realise that something was wrong. It seems at first as if the aircraft had disappeared between 3 points: Kuala Lumpur, Ho Chi Minh and Bangkok. Despite several attempts by air traffic control to contact the aircraft, all attempts at contact were unsuccessful. Both transponders on board the aircraft had ceased to function or had been disabled. Strangely, this happened at the exact moment the aircraft was in between the two airspaces. When the aircraft misses its arrival time in Beijing, there is finally an official state of emergency put into place, and 4 hours after losing contact with the aircraft, flight MH370 is finally declared missing. From here, the most expensive search for a missing aircraft in the whole of history was about to ensue, with the initial search taking place where the aircraft was first thought to have disappeared, between the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. It was an international effort by 34 ships and 28 aircraft from 7 different countries. However, 4 days into the search, the Malaysian military came forward to explain that the search was being focused in the wrong place, that they in fact had more information that they had withheld. Their long-range military radar that could track aircrafts better than commercial technology had detected that the aircraft had in fact changed its flight path by deviating slightly to the right and then sharply to the left, flying back on itself towards the Malay Peninsula, and then turning right again by the island of Penang, continuing on towards the Andaman Sea. According to experts, this manoeuvre could in fact only be carried out by someone physically in control of the aircraft, and that it would have taken up to an hour for this manoeuvre to have been completed. The aircraft continued on this path until eventually the military radar could no longer detect it. There was a SATCOM terminal that had logged onto the network before leaving the airport and established a connection in Australia. Those records between the aircraft and the Australian ground station showed that everything during the flight appeared normal until the aircraft made its sharp turn to the left. Shortly after this, the SATCOM link was disconnected. 3 minutes later, the terminal in the aircraft requested to log back onto the Australian ground station's SATCOM network, and the link was successful. It remained this way for the next 6 hours. This is when the flight perhaps crashed due to lack of fuel. 2 attempts were made to contact the plane via telecommunication. These attempts were acknowledged by the SATCOM link, which would have notified the cockpit, but both calls went unanswered. Experts analysed the data received from the SATCOM link by measuring 3 things: the time it took for signals to reach the plane from the satellite, fuel consumption, and weather. They were able to identify a potential location to search. This new flight path analysis moved the search to a part of the southern Indian Ocean. The closest nation to this new zone was Australia, and so they headed the efforts in looking for the missing aircraft. The search effort eventually covered 4.5 million square kilometres of ocean, and following new analysis of potential flight paths and oceanic drift, the vessels ended up searching in one of the most remote bodies of water in the world. The surface search for Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 ended on April 28th. Underwater hydrophones in the areas being searched had their data analysed but provided nothing of interest. The aircraft was also fitted with underwater signal beacons that had the battery life of around 40 days. Some signals similar to those that the beacon would release were detected in the area at some 3,000 metres, but underwater equipment could not find any signs of the plane. There was no sign at all of the aircraft until the 29th of July 2015, some 15 months after the initial disappearance. 2,500 miles west of the search area, a flaperon broken off of the wing washed up on the French island of Réunion. Since then, other smaller pieces have been discovered. Blaine Gibson is an American lawyer who was an avid traveller and has the goal of visiting every country. Gibson is also an adventurer and is one of the people who continues the search efforts for this aircraft to this very day. A 2016 article written by Elle Hunt for the Guardian website says, when the plane disappeared, Gibson was on an infrequent trip back to the US, tasked with selling the family home in California that, with his parents both gone and his constant globe-trotting, had become a burden. I sat glued to the TV, more than I normally would, because I had to be there to sign documents, do inspections, sort through all my family memories. Gibson spent much of the next year in Laos, helping friends set up a karaoke bar, but maintained an active interest in the search and in discussion groups on Facebook. One such group, MH370 in Search of the Truth, now has more than 3,600 active members, and Gibson was one of the first. He flew to Kuala Lumpur for the public service marking the first anniversary of the plane's disappearance, and was moved by a heartrending speech by Grace Subbathirai Nathan, whose mother was on the plane and who continues to speak on behalf of families of missing passengers. That made me think, this is something that maybe I can do. To do what I love doing anyhow, travel and solving mysteries, but also have a reason for it. He is now friends with Nathan and many other MH370 families." End quote. Gibson's search was narrowed down after initial debris the flaperon was found on Reunion Island. Gibson began visiting areas where he thought he might find more debris. He chose these areas after speaking with experts and scientists about weather systems and drift patterns. He started in Mozambique on the advice of these experts and began speaking with local fishermen about where they often found items washed up on shore. Surely enough, he found a washed-up piece of the plane that is assumed to have belonged to MH370. Gibson recruited locals all up and down the Indian Ocean coastline, who collected pieces of debris. Gibson would often pay these people for their finds. To this day, lots of pieces assumed to have belonged to the aircraft have been found. 1/4 of the overall debris located was found by Gibson himself. Gibson believes the aircraft is intact on the ocean floor and uses the fact that nothing like seat cushions, life jackets or even bodies have ever washed up from MH370. He doesn't believe the theories that suggest the plane broke up into pieces in mid-air. There were 3 official investigations into the disappearance of the aircraft. Australia led the initial investigation because they were closest to the suspected site of the crash, and the search efforts were conducted 1,200 miles southwest of Perth. Not only this, Australia were also well equipped to navigate the initial search for the aircraft. They started by air but 2 months and no success, but after 2 months and no success, they turned to mapping out the seafloor and even then found no sign of the missing airplane. They looked in the deepest and most unsearched areas of the Indian Ocean floor. They ended their search and closed their investigation 3 years later after spending $130 million and having nothing to show for their money. The second investigation was an internal one carried out by the Malaysian police. This mostly consisted of background checks on passengers and crew. Years later, they released the official report in 2017, which basically said that they were unable to determine a cause for the disappearance of the aircraft. The passengers and crew were ruled out by official authorities, but what was ascertained at some point during these 3 investigations was that 2 people were found to be holding false passports and were later determined to be asylum seekers. 2 Iranians on forged passports, Interpol revealed, had no links to terror organisations. Pouria Noor Mohammed, 19, and Syed Mohammed Reza Delaware, 29, were 2 Iranian men travelling with forged passports. They were friends and were hoping to seek asylum in Europe, according to Malaysian officials. No terror organisation ever stepped forward to claim responsibility, so any official inclination that this was an act of terrorism was essentially ruled out. The third investigation was also unable to determine a cause for disappearance and closed swiftly. But the efforts haven't stopped completely. There is a private group who call themselves the Independent Group, made up of scientists and engineers from around the world. They met online and have studied all available data and radar analysis to narrow down the areas of interest, using this information to pinpoint trajectory and last known location. Other groups have worked backwards from where the initial debris was found on shore, using oceanic drift patterns and weather systems to recreate the debris' journey to attempt to pinpoint potential locations where the plane could be resting on the ocean floor. There is also an Australian man who claims to have located the wreckage on Google Earth, claiming that it is still intact and in shallow waters. He set up an online crowdfunder with the target of $1.5 million, asking people to donate to his expedition. Once he had reached the target, he promised to share the information but told the world that he would be keeping it to himself until he reached his target. The fundraiser only managed to raise half the money, totaling around $750,000, before it was no longer active. The man leading the crowdfunder has never released this information. So what are the theories surrounding the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370? Firstly, there are all the reasons a plane might suddenly vanish: a freak weather accident, a fire inside the cabin that caused the plane to lose oxygen, making everyone pass out and the plane go off course, disabling equipment and essentially suffocating all on board. Or theory 2, this was the case of alien abduction, causing the plane to vanish. Or alien abduction gone wrong, that caused the plane to break up mid-air. Or theory 3, that the plane was hijacked. CNN's coverage of the aircraft focused heavily on this theory, with aviation expert Jeff Wise, now a member of the Independent Group, talking us through how this could have happened. The theory is centered on the fact that 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductors, an avionics firm said to specialize in stealth technology, were on board MH370. Wise believes that bogus data was fed to the satellite, while the 2 Ukrainians who had supposedly come from Odessa, a former Soviet naval base, and a Russian who had a hobby of scuba diving, took a bag of scuba gear on board with 3 full face masks, and when the crew weren't looking, he slipped into the electronics and equipment, or EE bay, which could be accessed through the hatch in the front of first class, and from there took control of the plane. He cut off all communication, then plugged in portable equipment that would upload false satellite information. From EE, he then depressurized the cabin, while he and his accomplices wore the face masks. Wise then reckons that the plane was turned towards Kazakhstan, sending the last electronic handshake to Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, which is leased by Russia to launch rockets supplying the space station. Baikonur had a runway nearly 15,000 feet long, built to land the Buran spaceplane, the Soviet Union's version of the space shuttle. The program was cancelled in 1993, but this is the only airstrip in the world purposefully built specifically for self-landing aeroplanes, and the Boeing 777 has an auto-landing system. Wise says he can offer no motive for the hijacking, but perhaps they repressurized the cabin and kidnapped 20 employees, who are now building Russia's stealth cloaking systems. Then there is Theory 4, posed to us by other CNN coverage, and anchor Dan Lemon, who suggested that this was the work of a black hole or time warp, although other experts have said that a black hole of this size would suck in our entire solar system. Then there is Theory 5, which is given to us by a British tarot card reader, who was sunbathing on holiday when she witnessed what was either a missile or a plane attempting a suicide mission. When she learned of the missing aircraft, she concluded that this must be what she witnessed, though she was nowhere near any of the mentioned locations that the aircraft had been suspected to have flown by. One of the final theories is Theory 6, and possibly the most convincing theory to date, and that is that this was a tragic case of pilot suicide. Experienced Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah was initially cleared by the Malaysian internal investigation, but reports later revealed that Shah was going through a divorce, was likely depressed, and even had a flight simulator at home that had this exact route in its aviation history. Though it should be mentioned here that there were hundreds of explored routes on this simulator, and this alone does not supply concrete evidence of pilot suicide. It is posed by experts that the 1-hour manoeuvre must have been carried out by Shah, that communications were disconnected by the pilot, and that data received suggested that the plane plummeted into the ocean must have been the work of someone who had manual control over the aircraft. The plane supposedly cruised on autopilot for 6 hours towards Antarctica, looking as if it was purposefully taken to one of the most remote locations on Earth. The final descent of the aircraft reportedly took place at 15,000 feet per second, crashing into the water 5 times faster than an unmanned or unexpected crash, showing that this was potentially purposeful. Research suggests that most passengers would have passed away before the crash. Data shows that electronic systems were disabled, including air pressurization. Whoever was in charge of the plane accelerated the depressurization of the cabin by climbing to altitudes just inside the plane's capabilities. Masks would have dropped, but wouldn't have worked at this height, causing everyone on board to pass out and die gently, all except perhaps the pilot and co-pilot, who would have had an extra hour of oxygen supply in the cockpit. Does MH17 being shot down so soon after have anything to do with this missing aircraft? Blaine Gibson is absolutely sure the plane is intact on the ocean floor. But what are your thoughts, and what do you believe happened? Let me know at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Conspiracy Vault.